I think we'll go ahead and get started right on time at 2:15. I have two people from the Netherlands next to me, so I'll make sure to start on time. And I believe our online connection is also good to our third speaker, who is online and will hopefully be coming up on the screen, I believe, very soon. Oh, great. Hello, hello. So hello, everyone. Very glad to see you all here. We have a full house today, so it should be a very interesting and lively panel. My name is Slavina Ancheva. I will be the moderator today. I'm a policy advisor at the European Parliament for MEP Eva Meidel, who actually spoke at a panel on AI earlier today, so maybe some of you saw her there. I've previously worked on the Digital Services Act and now on the AI Act, so I'm very excited to hear what our experts here have to say, and from all of you in the audience, of course. So the panel topic today, research and best practices to address socio-technical risks in AI systems. So we're going to be looking at some of the most challenging problems and advances in research to support fairness, accountability, transparency, and equity in AI. The panel will also examine whether the AI Act's requirements for trustworthiness will be flexible enough to address these objectives, nuanced enough to tackle the diversity of AI systems and the specific risks, as well as the pace of innovation. So being in the middle of the AI Act negotiations right now, I'd be very glad to talk AI Act the whole time, but I'm sure we'll also have a bit of a broader debate on some of these socio-technical risks. So I would just maybe, as background, say when we talk about AI and risk, I think it's looking at a much bigger and broader picture than we're maybe used to when talking about product safety legislation. So we're not just looking at risks to health, like with medical devices, or we're not just looking at risks to the environment. We're really looking at direct risks to fundamental rights and health and the environment, but also some of these broader risks, the socio-technical concerns that come up when you have humans and technology interacting. So I think it'll be very interesting to get into some of these implications today and talk about the ways that technology shape and direct the societies that they're embedded in. So we need more focused debates like this, and I think today's debate will be an example of this. I have three excellent speakers here with me today to give us some insights. So I'll go ahead and present them in order of their interventions. So sitting next to me, we have Dr. Stefan Balsman, who's an assistant professor at Delft University of Technology. Dr. Balsman studied computer science and philosophy in Leiden and completed his PhD on the philosophy of mathematics at Stockholm University when he was 20. He then conducted research on the intersection of philosophy of mathematics and cognitive science. He's also engaged in popular science writing, publishing 3 books, the most recent being on AI and its links to philosophy, which brings him to Delft. So his research focuses on the explainability of AI algorithms and how can they be designed to be used more responsibly and beneficially, and work on fairness and transparency, for example. Then we have Colin van Noort, who is a PhD researcher at the Ragnar Nurks Department of Innovation and Governance at Tallinn University in Estonia. He was working as an external expert also for the European Commission's AI Watch team, where he's contributing to the research activities on the use of AI within the public sector. He's the co-author of the AI Watch Artificial Intelligence and Public Services report from the Joint Research Center, and he regularly publishes on the use of AI in government. So 2 very interesting perspectives up here. And then online, and hopefully he can hear us, I think he can, we have Michael Midday, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Microsoft Research. He's actually based in New York, so thank you for joining us online today. Very excited to have you. So he's a postdoctoral researcher at Microsoft, as I mentioned, working with the FATE research group, standing for Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics in AI. He recently completed his PhD at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon, where he was a Siebel Scholar and a fellow in their interdisciplinary education research program. Before that, he was at Georgia Tech, and his research today draws on some of the theories and methods that he covered at Carnegie Mellon, and how they apply to work on fairness and equity in AI, focusing especially on how stakeholders are impacted by AI. So really looking forward to getting your view as well. Today, I would like us to start off with some introductory remarks from these three speakers, after which we'll have about a 25-30-minute discussion amongst us, and at around 3 o'clock, we'll aim to open it up to the audience. As I can see, we have many of you. I think we'd have some very interesting questions. So on that note, I will hand it off first to Stefan, asking him to tell us a little bit about his research, especially focusing on some of these socio-technical challenges.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you for having me. As you already said, I mostly work on the epistemic challenges of applying AI. So explainability, but I think for this socio-technical context, it's good to view that in a slightly more broad sense than purely these explainability tools that you can use for post hoc explanations of machine learning systems. And to look instead at, well, what kind of information do different users of this technology need, whether it's the decision makers who are choosing whether to apply these algorithms or the functionaries who have to make decisions based on advice they're getting from AI systems or the people impacted by these systems. What kind of information do they need to responsibly interact with AI systems? So my role as a philosopher here is, I don't think, not to build these technologies, of course, but mostly to figure out, okay, in what kind of settings, what kind of information are we going to need? And a lot of the work I do in Delft is to then try to connect with engineers to make sure that we're actually developing these tools that we're going to require. So that's personally on explainability on my end. I'm also part, as managing director now, of the Delft Digital Ethics Center, where we do this a bit more broadly in terms of, well, we have all these ethical concerns and we have all these values in the AI Act that are coming up. And a big piece of work is going to be translating those values into specific design requirements for different applications and ensuring that we actually embed those values into the technological systems, in the socio-technical systems that we're building. So at the center, we have a group of people working partly on methodology. How are you going to do this? What are these values? How are you going to check or verify that those values are embedded? We have a large group of people working on the more moral, democratic values like autonomy, privacy, and so on, specifying those, and then I'm running the group on epistemic values like explainability and trust in these systems. And I think we'll stop there so we have lots of time for discussion. Colin.
Yeah, thank you. Also very impressive. So it touches upon a lot of the work that I've been doing, but I'm a bit further down the road. So I researched a lot of how these technologies are being used in government organizations. So we are talking about risks, but these technologies can also help governments significantly. They're often under a lot of social challenges now, especially the last few years, and are still ongoing. They have to do a lot with increasingly limited resources, about money as well as personnel. So there's a lot of opportunities for these technologies, but we need to find out, okay, so how are they really being deployed and to which effect? Because we, especially all these people here in the room, we have a lot of potential maybe hype or dreams about this technology, but the most important thing is to know, okay, what are the real results and is this beneficial to society? So with that lens, I've been looking a lot with the research for my PhD. I do that with AI Watch. Okay, so how are these technologies being used? And more importantly, maybe not used, because a lot of government organizations are quite risk averse. They tend not to really willing to innovate or really change the way they do things. So you see on the one hand this conflict a little bit on, okay, we have all these opportunities, but there are some risks as well, and how do these organizations really decide to use it or integrate it? So that's what I try to figure out with the research, and finding specific examples and case studies where they've gone through that process and to see some effects. And with most of the research I see, like the really fancy stuff you see Google present, or maybe others at the conference today, that seems to be still mostly within the labs. The actual applications in government tend to be a bit more simple. I think about automatic transcriptions of parliamentary hearings, or small automation of forms to really reduce the time it takes to get an application. Stuff like that. It's not really, we're not there yet to really have self-driving or lawyers, lawmaking politicians replaced by robots, as maybe some stories from a few years ago suggest. So that's what I try to understand. And of course, there are some serious ethical risks, and especially in a government context where you often deal with vulnerable citizens. You need to make sure that you're helping the people that you're supposed to help and not putting them more into misery. So there's a great interplay and really understanding, being responsible with what is the technology doing, are you using it for a good purpose, and then of course seeing if after a while it's actually giving you the effects that you need. There's still a long way to go there. There's still a lot we don't know.
Absolutely. And there's already some points here which I would love to pick up on, but I'll hand it over to Michael to get his introductory remarks as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm Michael Midday. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Microsoft Research. A lot of the work that I do these days focuses on how we can take human-centered research and design methods and apply those to design processes for AI systems. And specifically, there's a lot within Microsoft and other technology companies, a lot of emerging standards and goals for responsible AI. But for the product teams who are designing AI systems, designing and deploying them, there's often a gap between the expectations in some of these principles and standards and then the reality of the tools and practices that they have available. And some of you may be familiar with many situations where issues related to fairness or responsible AI may only come to light after systems are already deployed and already causing harm. And so one of the big areas of focus in my research and working with many of my colleagues here is trying to develop more proactive approaches and really try to develop and co-design more processes and tools that support awareness of these socio-technical risks. So for instance, the fact that fairness is something that is deeply contextual and really cannot just be abstracted away and measured with mathematical metrics in isolation from the context of how it's going to be used, the sociocultural context, the geopolitical context, and the specific use case and scenarios, given all of the historical legacies of inequities and potential for different types of harms. So a lot of the research we do is working with product teams to understand how do they become aware of different types of fairness related harms, whether those are related to performance disparities in the sort of quality of service that downstream users or other stakeholders might experience, whether those are harms related to how systems might allocate different resources or opportunities, or how systems might misrepresent or cause representational harms by stereotyping or denigrating or even erasing different groups of people. So that's been a lot of the focus of the work. And I think one of the key lessons from HCI is that technologies really can't be understood sort of divorced from the social context of design and use. And I think that's equally true both for AI systems that need to be understood in their sociocultural context of design and use, but also for the kinds of tools and toolkits that are out there for so-called responsible AI to make sure that those toolkits also are able to be used by their intended users, whether that's designers of AI systems, deploying agencies or organizations or people, or ideally broader sets of stakeholders who should be involved in the work of fairness and responsible AI.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'll come right back to you after. I'll follow up maybe a bit up here first. So Stefan, I think it's very interesting that the work you're doing, it's between sort of philosophy and engineering and mathematics and AI. I think it's really intersectional, and I think there's a lot to be discussed there. Maybe I would start off with a statement that you made about how it's very difficult to translate values into design requirements. And I think this is part of the discussion that we have every day in the European Parliament, because because, you know, we want an AI Act that's based on European values, but then when you have to actually put pen to paper, what does that mean in terms of technical requirements or socio-technical requirements? And a lot of those conversations around bias, for example, also have to do with explainability, which is something that you focus on. So there's a lot of talk about the black box metaphor and how much can we really know what's happening inside these systems, or how much information should we be able to give to affected users, for example. So maybe to get your thoughts on this, I would pose some questions. How can explainability tools, for example, support us when we're trying to meet the challenges of ethical use? What format should such explanations take? And how much could we really expect these AI systems to be explainable? To what extent? What kind of obligations could we have for them in terms of explainability?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a big question to tackle, but if we start, I think it's a nice place to start with what the ideal situation would be like. So if you look at what explainability ultimately would be like, I think is that you can give reasons why the AI system says what it does, and that those reasons are specific to the interest you have. So I think something you don't see in the current tools yet, but which is very prevalent in the philosophical literature, is that there's always this kind of contrast to which you're comparing the outcome you're interested in. So if a child throws his plate of food on the floor, you're asking, why did you do this? Then there's a specific interest you have in mind. Sort of you're asking, okay, why did you throw it on the floor rather than leaving it there? Which is why the child saying, oh, I was full, is a really bad answer to your question of an explanation. So you have some kind of interest in mind for why am I asking this explanation? And at the moment, I mean, technically speaking, of course, we can introduce this requirement of, well, you should be able to give these answers, but we don't have anything that's able to do that. I mean, feature importance maps and counterfactuals and so on, they're all technical ways of trying to offer some extra information, but there are a lot of limitations to how these technologies work. Often they disagree in terms of what they give you as an answer for why the system says something. So they'll point to different variables being important for the exact same output of the exact same system. Or if you measure in practice, it turns out that people aren't actually better able to predict what the system is going to do. So here I think it's good to start to try to test this goal we have. Okay, we want to have explanations, we want these reasons, and we want them for a specific goal. Better accountability or better detection of bias. That's something you can start to measure. And then how you are going to technically solve this is very much an open question. And I think we still have a long way to go on making explainability tools that are going to get you there. But at least by proceeding from the goals, what is the ultimate impact this should have, you can make a start. And then maybe explainability tools will help, maybe something else. For example, if you look at operators who have to make decisions with an AI system telling them what they should be doing. In some Dutch cases, for example, they would just get the output score of the AI system, and then they were asked, do you agree, yes or no? Or you don't have any contextual information, any reasons for disagreeing with the system, so automatically everyone is going to say yes to everything, and there's no actual human oversight. So then it's going to be relevant to maybe not offer explanations, but more contextual information of, oh, this might be an outlier, so you should check particularly well if the system is correct here. Or here's another reason that the system, or another source of data that the system didn't consider. Take another look, to offer this kind of extra information, which might not be explanations, but is still germane to the goals you're trying to achieve.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's a very important concept, not just human oversight, but meaningful human oversight. And I think that's absolutely key also to when the public sector, when governments are using this, because I can imagine explainability would be one of the main variables. That is the reason that some governments might be risk averse. I mean, how would you explain to citizens why a certain decision was taken? And I think given the work that you're doing, Colin, seeing how some of this is being put into practice, so to say, so not at the beginning philosophical stages, but more so in real life. What are some of the key socio-technical risks in the use of AI systems by the public sector, and how can we address some of these risks?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question we can have a 5-hour panel discussion on, right? Because there's so many things. And I would say, especially the AI systems used in a government context, I would argue need to be even better than the ones you see in businesses or elsewhere in society because of the impact it has on citizens, and often also the fact you are usually obligated to, respond to government services or requests or these kind of things. So there must be a higher standard of practices. And explainability is definitely one of them. I would say not only in terms of for us citizens or researchers to see, okay, what's going on, what is the government doing as a form of external accountability, but very often you see a lot of these AI projects in government struggle is because they cannot even explain it to their own staff members. So imagine you are a civil servant and you have to help, I don't know, vulnerable children, for instance. It's a very important job, very risky, of course. And you get a system that suggests, okay, you need to take this person and take him away from the family. And you cannot understand why the system is suggesting this. Or there's no way to see what variables are influencing the system. Or even weirder, if you press reset and you get a different result of the same case, right? So all these things happen, and it makes it very, I would say very tricky to work with such systems in a government high-stake context. And I remember you saying, you get a yes-no answer, but there are plenty of examples. I mean, not Netherlands, but there is also one case studied in the academic circle. It was in Poland, unemployment benefits. So they tried to also categorize people who was more likely to get a new job or who would drain more resources, and then of course they would put those that are the easiest, they would get priority. Not what I would do as a government, because those that are easy probably will find a job anyway, but you see in an efficiency rationale, they decide to do so. And what they found out, these researchers, is that 99% were also automatically all approved because there was almost no way for them to counteract the results. There was no way to discuss, or even there was managerial pressure to cut costs, so they would always have to say yes. So you see, there's a lot of surrounding context. I mean, these are the bad examples. There's plenty of also really beneficial ways where waiting time was, for instance, reduced from 1 month to 2 days, right? These are quite nice benefits, but you see this tension arising. So there's definitely a couple of key risks, and I would say they counteract a bit the rationale is why we want to have these systems in place. So usually in a lot of research circles you see, okay, well, it can make governments actually more inclusive because we have more data, we can have more people heard, maybe in a role at the parliament, for instance, you can analyze all the input from consultation processes, so instead of going through that all manually, you can have a system really help you out in understanding what are the key topics and the key things that are on people's agenda. Fantastic. I think that's a great way to save not only a lot of time, but it could help make it very inclusive. At the same time, the risk then is that, well, not everybody is in this data. And if you assume that, okay, this is reality, it's not. Because there's just a lot of things that are not included, certain demographics that will not be there. So you need to always be aware of these things. And that's the same for other things also with biases. Yeah, some ways you can predict, but maybe the predictions are a bit biased. So how do you counteract this? How do you train your civil servants to make sure to spot mistakes? How to work with the system? And this is all like a surrounding context. And I think your work touches upon very nicely on, okay, how can you design it to make sure it is understandable for those that have to work with it, because I think it's really fundamental moving forward, because we know they make mistakes, but you need to see when and how to mitigate it. I think this is very crucial in government.
No, absolutely. And thank you for bringing in some of those examples. I think to pick up on your last one, yeah, in theory, it'd be great to have an AI system running through some of the input that we get or the position papers or the consultations. Mm-hmm. But then you have that element of when you actually meet with someone or when the member of parliament meets with someone and hears a story or maybe gets one aspect that system wouldn't have picked up. And I think that's exactly that human element which you also brought up in this, which can be very difficult in those situations. I think that ties in quite well to some of the work that Michael is doing in terms of stakeholders and stakeholder engagement, which we've also been talking about a bit up here. When we talk about stakeholders, I think it's fairly easy to imagine who are the direct stakeholders involved. But often there's indirect stakeholders that are maybe impacted by these systems. And there it's not quite clear how they will be affected or how they can even have their voices heard, so to say. And I know that this is some of the work that you're doing. So I'd be very curious to hear about this engagement with indirect stakeholders, how it's done in practice as these AI systems are being employed in these different socioeconomic and geopolitical contexts, which you brought up. So how can these stakeholders impacted by AI participate in designing fair and more socially responsible AI?
Yeah, so I think that's the huge question that a field is really grappling with right now. So I think the point that you raised towards the end of the scale that teams are deploying these systems at is something that comes up over and over and over as in our research with product teams who are trying to assess for performance disparities, but are deploying systems across maybe dozens of different cultural contexts and trying to figure out how do they actually identify which types of fairness harms might be relevant, what does marginalization mean in these different contexts, and how do they engage with stakeholders. So there's, I will say that AI is not the first field to grapple with this, although AI often likes to think that it's the first to do many things. And in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of interest in more participatory approaches in AI. I will say, though, that some research that colleagues of mine at Cornell, Jian Yang and Fernando Delgado and others, and I have been doing is looking at the sort of current trend and current interest in participatory AI and trying to tease out what people actually mean by that. What is it that they're actually doing versus what goals do they say they have for this type of participation? And I think, let me just give one example here, maybe to go back to that example of in public sector, for instance, in Pennsylvania, in Allegheny County, in the US, there's been a lot of interest in developing screening technologies for child welfare caseworkers. And in those settings, the stakeholders involved are, of course, the children, the families, the end users, right, are maybe these caseworkers who are using it, but often the design paradigms in AI draw on this sort of user-centered design approach from HCI, and there's real limitations when you're designing just for sort of the end user or the consumers, which unfortunately too often in consumer technology, the focus is designing for the customer or the end user rather than the sort of wider web of stakeholders who might be impacted. And so in those types of situations, unfortunately, too often the other stakeholders, children, families, et cetera, are only brought into the design process, if they're brought in at all, after there's already an algorithm that's designed and often after it's already being used in context. And in those situations, it's really critical to try to understand what are these existing sort of power dynamics involved. So in HCI, there have been traditions for the last couple of decades for participatory design that grew out of designing for sort of workplace technologies in Scandinavian contexts that recognized that workplace technologies were shaping the power dynamics of office work, and that workers should have a say in not only how the technologies were being designed, but how they were being used and what kinds of effects they might have on the power structures in their workplace and society at large. So there are some these design paradigms that are out there for technology more broadly, or civic participation and participatory budgeting. But even in those examples, there's been research showing that who is able to participate, for instance, in like showing up to a town hall or a participatory budgeting session, may reinforce existing inequities based on like who has free time to show up or access to transportation where they can get to the town halls, or in the case of AI, who might have background knowledge or the self-efficacy to participate in some of these town hall and community discussions. So some cities in the US, and I know some in Europe and other parts of the world, are exploring things like public task forces. So in Pittsburgh, there's this algorithmic task force. Excuse me. New York has been working on some similar approaches of opening up algorithmic systems, algorithmic decision systems to public commentary, public input. But as I mentioned, those traditions, those sort of paradigms for public comment in the form of town halls, bring with them their own sort of opportunities to amplify inequity. So I think there's real open questions about how do we do this in ways that are meaningful, that allow for meaningful stakeholder participation, in ways that don't amplify or reinforce existing power dynamics within stakeholder groups or between stakeholder groups, and in ways that involve the stakeholders ideally more proactively earlier in the design life cycle before systems are out there in the world.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting challenges in addition to this is that very often the indirect stakeholders might not be obvious at the start of the development process. So to take a concrete example, it turns out that when navigation apps redirect traffic, when there's a big traffic jam on the highway, you end up with lots of increased traffic in sort of neighborhoods on the outskirts of cities, especially in the US. So you get impact on people living in these neighborhoods where safety decreases, traffic time increases, and so on. And I think no one initially expected this to happen from having these navigation apps function in this way. And likewise in the public sector, there might be an algorithm running in one ministry and then output is used by another ministry. The original development of the first algorithm can't take into effect the reuse of all of the decision making that's coming after that. So it's in development and in the sort of interactive use of the technologies, you often see new stakeholders emerge. And so it's really difficult to keep updating that and to actively take that into account throughout the life cycle.
Yeah, and I would definitely like to highlight, I really like the stakeholder perspective. Like, do they need it? Do they want it? I think this is really fundamental for government use by these technologies. I mean, now we're in Belgium. I'm living in Estonia. It's a very different context. Very different. People are much more easygoing with government use of technology. So I can give an example also to promote Estonia a little bit. But they want, for instance, to create a virtual assistant that is very statewide. I mean, I think many of you are from Belgium here. You probably know how much of a hassle it can be to find the right authority here that deals with your particular issue. See some of you smiling. So, this is probably an issue. So what they want to do is to create just one, like an Alexa, but then for government. So you say, oh, I have an issue, my wallet got stolen, or I need to do this. And it would automatically give you either the right authority, or even better, just do the service for you. So you don't even need to go to a location. It's still in development, it's not there yet, but that's the vision they have. And very much in favor. Imagine that being put directly translated into Belgian context. I can imagine there will be, all of the administrations will be already fighting each other. No, this is incorrect, or this needs to be prioritized. So you see that different contexts, you cannot really replicate it. But it can also be specific applications where in Estonia they may be much more easygoing. Oh, it's fine if the government does it proactive, so I don't need to go to an office. But in other countries they may be, well, I would actually like to see or have a document or a check or see if it's going well. So you have all these different attitudes, and even between demographics, because we're a young panel, but there's definitely a lot of people that do not like all this automated stuff. you need to know this. So I fully agree. The stakeholder perspective is quite vital in understanding what is needed, what kind of considerations do you need to make at start, and how do you make sure there's enough acceptance. But it's not very obvious always from the start. Yeah.
I think Michael wants to come in. Yeah.
Yes, thanks. So that may be true, and I guess I would maybe qualify that piece about whether it may not be obvious who the indirect stakeholders are. So I agree, and it's particularly in many systems that operate in the background. And so I'm thinking, for instance, for certain types of like natural language systems that maybe do some type of maybe content moderation or hate speech detection, things that until a particular user's message is flagged, they may not be aware that they're a specific type of technology is operating. I definitely agree that, the sort of visibility of whether and how systems are working. I guess the other thing that has come up in some of our research and other folks' research too is just the issue of representation and to what extent the product teams who are designing and developing systems and the groups who are deploying the systems are representative of the sort of larger population who might be impacted, right? And I say that because some of the research that's been done on the sort of like failures of imagination of whether that's AI researchers or AI product teams suggests that having more diverse and more representative designers. Now, this isn't the only solution, and there's good reason to be skeptical of the sort of politics of inclusion, as Iris Marion Young has called it, that suggests that simply having more diverse voices involved will necessarily make things more equitable. But that might be one way to broaden the perspectives involved, to be able to maybe have a bit more, maybe take off those sort of like rose-tinted glasses that many researchers and designers have on about all the sort of positive outcomes of the system, and be a bit more skeptical of all the ways that it might go wrong.
No, thank you for coming in with that. And I think some of these conversations that we're having about to what extent should stakeholders be involved, how can we better involve them, but also a lot about the differences in geographic and social context. That's a lot of the discussions we're having on the EU's AI Act right now, because we're looking at legislation that will potentially impact, not just the EU, but also beyond. So as you're bringing up some of these specific use cases, I find myself thinking, if we had the AI Act or some version of it that's yet to be finalized in practice today or in effect, how much of these risks that you bring up, how many would be mitigated? It's a hypothetical question I'm asking myself, but I'll turn it into maybe a more concrete one for the three of you. And you can get as into the details of the AI Act as you want or not, maybe just more broadly also in terms of regulation. But when we're regulating AI, there is a risk of this overemphasis on technical requirements. So you're saying you need to have this sort of, for example, accuracy and robustness and this level of cybersecurity. But we do have a risk that we're going to disregard maybe some of the more collective and societal harms that you've been bringing up here today. They're linked, but it's not the full picture. So I'm wondering, how can these risks be better integrated into upcoming regulation like the AI Act? How can we take a broader look at these collective risks? Anyone can pick up on it, but maybe all three of you will have something to say.
Yeah, I can start. So the AI Act in itself, that's a big piece of legislation to go through, and I don't think we need to go too much into details. But I think the narrative behind the legislation is that to have some extra checks and balances before we start cowboying with this technology, and especially, most of as I understood from the impact assessments done, most AI will be not considered high risk, as I understood. But almost all of them used in government will be considered as such, at least in the latest version that I'm aware of. I think it's fair point that these checks extra exist to go through and think, well, is this really working as intended? What are some of the risks? What do we have to do to mitigate some of them? I think having this necessary reflection takes away a lot of concerns as well. You usually hear the debate, it's hindering innovation, but I would say if you have a bit more robust understanding of, okay, so this is what we're dealing with, you would be more willing to accept the ups and downs. So in that sense, I think it can quite help government use in areas where it's needed. At the same time, I agree there's a lot of assessments at the start or only the system. And in my experience, are all government organizations really ready for highly sophisticated systems used in their organization? Some yes, some no. I mean, let's keep it in the room, but I did a survey in Belgium administrations. It's not fully representative, I think, but I asked them, so does your organization, public administration, have enough expertise in AI, do you think? 2% of the respondents said yes. 2%. So I think that shows a picture too, that we may have all the requirements of the development, and they are absolutely needed. But also to integrate this in your organization, you need more than just a checklist. You need to make sure that there's also staff members that can know what they're dealing with, how can you monitor the effectiveness, because these systems will change their performance, especially the ones that are even more complex. So you need also organizational readiness for that. I think there's still a lot to gain, and I think it goes a bit against some of the narrative that it will take away jobs and automation and everything. I think in a lot of organizations you need to change a lot of professions. So I like one of my colleagues, he made a paper and he called for instance, chatbots that are used by government agencies, they call them like a colleague in a sense, because you need to train it, work with this thing. If you let it go for a while, it will deteriorate. So they need to treat it as a colleague, very different than what they may expect at the first impact.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice point, and a lot of this is also in terms of how are we going to collaborate with these AI systems. So if we're focusing specifically on these technical requirements like accuracy and robustness and so on, then I think you'll miss a large part of the picture, both in terms of benefits that might go, that we might not realize. So for example, there was a recent test in Denmark on an AI system that detects cardiac arrests for people calling the emergency services. Yeah, it's the system. The AI system is about 90% accurate, and the people answering the phone are about 75% accurate. But they all refuse to use the system. So while they were evaluating this, 50 people or so died from cardiac arrests that were detected by the AI system, simply because people didn't trust it. So then, yes, we can have these human oversight requirements. And they can be very helpful in these cases, but at the same time, a lot of this is also of making sure we rely on the systems in the right situations, and then sometimes human oversight, when they overestimate their own capacities, can hurt. And I think this is sort of a general point for these metrics. So metrics help to measure what kind of goals you have for the system. It can be similar for fairness. But if you're focusing on a single case, let's say you want to give different parts of society, different groups, equal access to credit, so you give them equal proportion of loan applications gets approved. What will happen is that the poorer parts of society might get lots of loan applications approved that they can't afford, so they'll end up in debt, and inequality will increase over time, even though at every point on your metric you'll be doing perfectly because you're giving everyone 50% of all the loans they're asking for. So a lot of this is not just, we'll find a metric and then we're done, but it's very much what is it that we want to achieve with the system, and I think that's where the difficult part of interpreting these values is going to be, in terms of, okay, these are context specific. Fairness means something different for credit systems than it does for diagnostic tools in a hospital, where you care about making sure everyone gets treatment in the same proportion. And it's that part that's going to be very difficult, and which is also something that you can't really put into legislation, because it's going to vary so much. So I think that's where the socio-technical risks really are. Yeah. And I'm sure Michael has lots to say.
Yeah, so I want to caveat, I'm by no means an expert on the EU's AI Act. So I guess I want to respond to this question in a slightly different angle maybe than the other two, and focus our attention on, I guess, some of the different design paradigms for AI, right? That there are some approaches to AI systems that design them more as products for a particular use case where maybe the data is collected from that context and used to train that sort of single model, maybe in collaboration with a partnering agency, maybe not. So AI products. From, on the other hand, AI services, or sort of like larger class of AI systems that are more sort of platforms or APIs, or what some at Stanford have called these sort of foundation models, although there's reason to be skeptical of that nomenclature. But this sort of like large scale pre-trained models, whether for language or vision or other applications that then maybe get fine-tuned, or in the case of like an AI service or API, and there's some, of course, lots of variants here, right? That then get used for particular applications by other parties, whether maybe smaller companies who are using these AI APIs for use cases that the original developers may not have anticipated, may not even be aware of in certain cases. And I think this is where there's real risks, real socio-technical risks involved, because of the fact that some of these applications may fall into what scholars have called this like portability trap, or this sort of false belief that you can just lift up an algorithmic system from one context and port it into another and have it work in the same way, that maybe the potential risks and harms are the same in one context as the other, that even who the set of stakeholders are the same. And I think this poses real risks to the belief that you can measure whether it's fairness or what have you for a particular system without doing this in a context in which it's used for that use case. And this is something that has come up in some of our research with natural language teams over and over and over, where even going through these like publicly available, these are widely used processes for impact assessments, or using these widely available fairness and responsible AI toolkits, the assumption for many of those types of processes, practices, toolkits, et cetera, is that the teams developing the systems, that they know in advance a priori which use cases, which contexts, who the stakeholders are, which demographic groups might be at risk. There's lots of assumptions baked into those tools and processes that for teams, especially teams working on AI services, they may not know. And the deployers of those AI services may not themselves be going through these fairness assessments. So that's, I think, something that is this sort of current design paradigm for many AI systems poses real socio-technical risks that it would be important for any AI regulation to make sure that sort of both ends of the spectrum are covered, and that these assessments are taking place in a sort of way that is contextualized and appropriate for that use case and context.
Thank you, Michael, for bringing in that perspective. I think it just goes to show why it's so important to have the people that are involved with designing these systems also involved as this regulation is being drafted, or also for other parts of the world, because we want to make sure it's future-proof, and that no matter how these design challenges evolve, we're making sure that we still have some of these principles being a part of the regulation. In terms of the AI Act, I think part of the way we try to address some of these different contextual concerns is through this idea of intended purpose and the way that it'll be used in a certain context. But then again, that's also a very difficult and vague concept to clarify. And I think that's part of the ongoing work right now with that regulation. But I think one of the common themes that I saw throughout your comments, and maybe I'll allow myself one more question, after which I'd be very glad to open it up to the floor. So please prepare any questions you might have for our excellent speakers. But I think one common theme is this idea of social trust and how key that is going to be for any sort of development or uptake of AI systems in society. So you can have social trust from the point of view of the developers and the design principles that they're using, or the deployers, or there's a certain role for governments to play, of course, to make sure that the public is ready for these systems. And I think there's also the user element. I mean, you bring up the example of the cardiac arrest and the lack of trust on the user side, which some could say it's for good reason, of course. I mean, some are obviously very concerned with the quick uptake of such technologies. But I'm wondering, on the user side and the role of user awareness, how can these socio-technical risks be addressed through user interface? Not to say it should all be on the user, so to say, but is there anything we can do to bring them in and increase this social trust on their side as well? Would be glad to hear from the three of you, and then let's open it up to the floor right after.
Yeah, I mean, not so sure through the user interface. I would probably leave that question, that part of the question, to Stefan, who knows that much better. But there is, I think that is, I think one of the fundamental debates going into the future. And I think a lot of it has to do also with a bit demystifying AI. I think when I started 3-4 years ago on researching, oh my, the discussions we had were very different. That was super far advanced. It was very optimistic. I mean, I remember all these, by 2020 we will have self-driving cars. You know, like, that was the kind of atmosphere. Now I think we have nuanced a little bit, much more, and you see maybe that's the Brussels effect in that sense. But there are also risks, and we need to make sure the positive does not always outweighs the negative, and if there's negative, make sure it's not constantly on the same groups of people. So in that sense, the debate has, I think, matured a little bit. There still remains a lot of this myths, and I think over enthusiasm, overconfidence maybe in what these technologies can or cannot do. But yeah, the other side of the coin is rightfully so that the people themselves think they are better than some of the systems, and how to really balance those two, I wouldn't know. I think that is still a lot of work to figure out when it is better to have more human oversight, when it's better to have more computer oversight, because it's true, people also make a lot of mistakes. Yeah, that's an interesting question, but I think demystifying and then having some control also, and keeping the autonomy for those that have to work with it, seems, at least what I've seen in some of the examples, like feedback mechanisms. So one of them in Estonia, they actually really designed feedback mechanisms for civil servants working with the system. So every time they got a recommendation, they were kept the autonomy to override it or suggest or follow it, but they were always obligated to at least give some feedback on why they think the recommendation was nonsense or why it was good. So during new iterations, they would at least have the professional experience fed into the system. So I like that a lot. So at least that acknowledge from both sides. You know, there can be mistakes, but we need to learn together to get to an even better version in the future. But they kept that autonomy, and I think that is quite crucial still. I mean, that's, I think, for me, the European way, at least, on how to go ahead with this technology.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think as for the challenge of doing this in the user interface, it's really difficult. Part of it is, of course, you can introduce explanations, and then you'll see that people will trust the systems a little bit more. On the other hand, if you there's these studies where they show people random numbers that are supposed to explain the system, and then the developers will think that they're actionable and that they're useful, and the people who see them, who are laymen, think that this shows that the system is intelligent, and start believing in the value of these numbers. So it's very easy to mislead people into these kinds of considerations. I mean, we have the general tendency to anthropomorphize these systems, so that makes it very difficult to get this appropriate reliance on the AI systems. And I don't think we have a very good answer in the academic literature, at least on how to do this. So I think you're going to end up with more socio-technical solutions or attempts than purely technical ones, like offering more transparency, and I think you see, at least in the Netherlands, governments publishing lists of algorithms that they're using. They're not very actionable. They don't really tell you how these systems perform. They don't tell you what values they're supposed to embody, whether oversight is effective, for example, they'll just say, oh, there's a person at the end, and you have no idea if that person actually does anything meaningful. Or they'll say, oh, we'll try to make it fair, but you don't know if it actually is fair. So there's a lot of this question of how are you going to show this transparency and communicate this kind of thing. Part of it might be in the role you give AI systems. In New Zealand, for example, they've automated insurance claim evaluations where the AI system can completely automatically approve claims, but every time it's inclined to say no, it goes to a person to evaluate it by hand from scratch, where at least you have this explainability if something goes wrong, if there's a negative impact, and otherwise things are okay and efficient and much faster than they otherwise would be. So I think it's also a way of finding creative solutions to deal with the limitations that the technology has. Because we don't have this explainability, we're not going to have it for quite a while, so we need to find other ways to get the benefits. And those are going to be socio-technical mostly.
Absolutely. Maybe a first step is publishing those lists of algorithms, but there's a long way to go after that for meaningful oversight. I'll pass the floor to Michael and just ask if we have a microphone as well for later for the audience. I'm not sure, but great. Michael, maybe 1 minute for a quick thought, and then we'll open the floor.
Yeah, I'm skeptical that user interface is the right area to focus on. It feels a bit like techno-solutionism, which I know is popular in AI and HCI, and that it might run the risk of sort of tokenizing stakeholder input towards the end of the design lifecycle, after a system's already built, after it's in the world, where maybe, and this is something we saw when we surveyed like 60 AI papers that claim to be participatory. The vast majority only involved stakeholders after their system was involved in designing the user interface or in giving feedback in a user interface in a way that felt tokenistic, extractive, rather than being able to give input on the scope of the AI system. Should it be used at all? What types of data should be used to train it? And even though like sort of feedback mechanism you mentioned, feedback is great and feedback's important, but there's a real risk that it turns into a sort of comment box or suggestion box that no one ever looks at, and feedback is submitted but never actually acted on. And so I would also, suggest me to reorient to these sort of governance processes, mechanisms for meaningfully engaging stakeholders beyond just the user interface, but throughout the design lifecycle.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I will open up the floor now. I see here in the front row, maybe we can begin with a question and then maybe just a show of hands so we know how many we have left. Okay, a fair amount. We'll begin with this and then we'll take them one by one for now.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sarah Spiekermann from Vienna. I have a comment and also a question for you guys. Did you ever hear about the IEEE 7000 value-based engineering standard?
We co-wrote it in Delft, so yeah.
Okay. So since I co-chaired it and I don't know exactly who was part of the work group here, let me tell you a few things. A lot of the things you said this past hour, stakeholder involvement, participatory design, corporate culture, from principles to practice, embedding moral philosophy, all of that has been done. It's standardized, and ISO has adopted it this year. And now big corporations like BMW use it. There have been use cases. So I'm also saying this a little bit not to advertise my own role here, but I think the audience should know that it's there. Just Google IEEE 7000 and you'll find it. But against the background of that incredible work, we had 100 people involved. We had 100 people sending 1,000 comments and more to be replied to pass 5 years of ballots to actually have that passed. Now, in that work, I have faced a few things, and I wanted to ask you about that. So one thing is, we're talking about, let's say, a value like transparency. We are talking about safety. We're talking about privacy. But I'm wondering whether these aren't hygiene factors to a certain extent that companies need to comply to anyways. Privacy, for instance, is something, with GDPR, this conference is all about it. But who's caring about things like dignity? Who's thinking about well-being, conviviality, And now the AI Act comes with the European the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and there you see suddenly dignity. But if our research world is focusing, down the rabbit hole somewhere around fairness, and fairness is even just, one little part of dignity. And what about, for instance, you talked a lot about explainability, but really within the transparency value, you have that something is veridical, that it's complete, that it's meaningful. Who's taking care of that? And then to you also as a philosopher, my final question, sorry for taking that time, is people tend to talk about values. But I'm wondering, explainability is just a quality of a higher value, and what we put into the system is a value disposition. So actually we have, philosophically speaking here, an ontology of values, and I don't see any work being done by philosophers, also not in Delft, or perhaps you can correct me on that one, please, that is essential in order to build value-based systems. Yeah, so I've spoken a lot, and I hope that you can at least comment a little bit on that.
This question goes straight to Stefan, I think, next to me.
Sure. No, I think the range of values definitely is broader. I mean, so for example, for recruitment systems, you want to care about autonomy of self-representation, and that people somehow have a control over how they're represented to employers, which normally you would be able to do, but not perhaps in an AI system. There's going to be much more of this, and I agree that it's very easy to get focused on the things you can fix technically, or that there is some kind of way to work on this, like fairness, like explainability. And for fairness too, I would say a lot of the measures don't line up with distributive justice or procedural justice notions. So there's a lot of work to do there as well, in terms of, well, we want to, but the distributive justice notions are much harder because they're about society and how the goods should be distributed societally, where you don't necessarily have the single system having full control over that. Yes, so there's a lot to do there, and I think it's very good to point that out of you. So I'm glad you did that. I think it's hard to get these into the legislation, partly because the values are going to be specific to some use cases, where we're not going to just care about the values in the high-level expert group document, but we're going to care about a lot more if you want it to be done truly responsibly. So I'm not sure how easy that would be to include, but this is the kind of thing where you would say, well, do this broader negotiation of values, make your trade-offs explicit. What did you include? That's maybe the direction we should be going in, and I think having the basic set is a starting point. And then we'll also need more research on how to do the rest. Yeah.
Yes, it includes fundamental rights and also some references to standardization, where I imagine some of the work that you're bringing up would be there. But in essence, it is implicit, the values, but also explicit in terms of the fundamental rights. I'll see if anyone else has a quick comment, and then there's many questions also waiting to be asked. So I'm making sure we have 10 minutes left or so, a bit more.
Yeah, I would like to just thank you for highlighting it. I knew there was work ongoing, but clearly it's in a more advanced state than I originally thought. It just reminds me that now then there's still a lot of work to be done in moving from these principles and standards into actual practice, because last week the Dutch Court of Auditors also released a report. They examined 9 they called algorithms in the Dutch government, and 6 out of those 9 did not meet basic requirements, at least according to the Court of Auditors. So it's good that apparently all these things exist, but there seems to be a big gap then in really translating those into organizational practice. So, I mean, I don't know all the requirements by heart, but they seem, at least according to them, basic requirements. So I think that's quite shocking.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think we can take the next question all the way in the back, and then we'll make our way up after that again. I see one right in front of me, right here, who is very excited to ask.
Thank you. It was just a question about the possibility to introduce as a safeguard in the legislation the role of AI auditors. So someone that would provide an accurate report on the reliability and trustworthiness of the AI system. So someone independent and external to the organization, and to have a little bit the same role as accountants have today. So we have this AI auditor role, but was to understand a little bit your opinion on this point.
So the question is on AI auditors, which to my understanding is a bit similar maybe to the third-party conformity assessments in the AI Act, but maybe there's some other connection you could make there.
Yeah, so that was also the first thing I was thinking about. I mean, I don't know it super well, but as I understood, most of the AI Act relies still on self-assessment. So I would say there's room for external. So this was just a court of auditors, so, and that's really government use, right? So that's their link. I think there's a lot of improvements that can be made maybe, and to extend the scope of certification or auditing. But in general with the AI Act, yeah, I think it's a missing element still, that there is almost no external accreditation mechanism available. I think there's a lot of risk in self-assessment, especially what also was mentioned before, the stakeholders are put in the end probably just to, you know, tick the box, so to speak. I think it's hard if you do a self-assessment and you have such a financial gain in deploying an AI system that may have negative externalities to people that are not part of your organization. I think it would require a very conscious entrepreneur to say, well, okay, then we're not going to do it. I think with an external self-assessment you run, I think you have a more rigorous assessment of which is really the right way, especially those high-risk cases, yeah.
In the current proposal, just for context in the room, there's an Annex 3 and only the biometric facial recognition is currently foreseen to have this third-party risk assessment, with the Commission having the power to add third-party risk assessments for other sectors that are listed in that high-risk sector. But as the way it's foreseen right now, those are internal assessments of what's set out in the Act. And of course, these are ongoing discussions. But I'll bring Michael in, of course.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a great question, and I think we absolutely need third-party auditors involved in conducting impact assessments and other forms of assessment. And something we've seen in some of our research where, exactly to the point that was brought up, the organizational incentives for shipping products at rapid timelines might mean that teams may not have time to conduct assessments, or other incentives like the incentives towards scale I mentioned earlier might mean that teams that need to make prioritization decisions about how they conduct assessments for which groups and with which data sets. And so I think in too often in industry contexts, those sort of business priorities often shape those internal impact assessments, whether the individuals involved may want to or not. They're part of this larger organizational system, and their jobs may be impacted by those types of incentives. So we really need robust third-party audits. And I will say, with the challenge being making sure that the product teams are able to share things like the training data, things like specifications of model details, objective functions, et cetera, with these third-party auditors to make sure that the audits are able to be as robust as possible. Certainly research has shown that is incredibly important. And for so the other research showing that stakeholders are able to do some of these audits. So there's been some research on crowd audits, or the sort of everyday auditing of algorithmic systems, in part at least to sort of explore the landscape, or like the problem space of potential harms that then perhaps third-party auditors can build off of and conduct impact assessments.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Michael. I will come back up here or over back there. Perfect, if you have the microphone, and then we'll come up here to you. So
hi,
please
can you
go
hear
ahead.
Me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Thank you for the panel, but may I suggest strongly, before you demystify AI, you de-hype it. A lot of AI is hype. Right. The second thing is, I teach AI and I research AI. A lot of my computer science students, mainly boys, they think the solution is creating an algorithm. What we need is more of the general public, non-technical, involved as stakeholders. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree, right? I think that's maybe a bit of the whole culture to use technology to solve all social issues that maybe should not be solved with technologies, but we should look more into structural causes. I mean, I always like to highlight this example in many of my presentations or classrooms. Japan, for instance, a country plagued with old population, so they have an issue of they want more people to make children, but there's an issue with dating. There's not enough dating. Kids are not so people. There's an issue there. So what does the government do? They promote some kind of AI Tinder to solve that complication. Yes, maybe it helps, but the issue in Japan is not that people cannot find partners. It's the fact that they have 60-hour work weeks, very toxic work environments, very high cost of living. So people just don't have money for kids. That's the issue. You cannot make an algorithm for that, right? So maybe you can, but don't tell your students that. I don't know, but so. But I mean, so I fully agree, and demystifying AI would, at least according to me, include that, to also look a bit outside of the box and think, but what is really the problem that we're trying to solve here?
Absolutely. I think that example is really great. We'll come up here for a question, and then all the way back there. I'm hoping we have time before 3:30.
Thank you very much for this fascinating session. I have two questions. One is practical and one theoretical. The first question is about coordination of privacy program management and AI compliance. How do you think is AI compliance the part of privacy program management, and how do you think may look effective privacy and AI team? Should they be separate or join? And the second question is about corrective measures of AI Act, included in the AI Act. Let's imagine when the developer company creates trained AI models using ill-gotten data used without legal basis. And how do you think, is it enough to protect, to use the data, or maybe it is sometimes it is needed to protect delete algorithms, maybe you know some FTC cases like Cambridge Analytica or Evernote, when FTC ordered not just stop to use the data, but also to delete all the trained models used ill-gotten data. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'll open it up. I'm not sure if Michael has something to add. He's online, so maybe it's a bit more difficult to jump in spontaneously. If not, I'll come into these two.
So just to briefly say to your question around sort of coordination of like privacy programs and AI compliance, I do think there's a lot that the current conversation around responsible AI and fairness in AI can learn from the sort of previous conversations and legislation around data privacy, as well as things like accessibility of algorithmic systems. So I think in terms of like mechanisms and processes, I think this, we should not try to invent from whole cloth here, but to really try to adopt from others. And the other piece, that there are often tensions between privacy and being able to conduct at least fairness assessments. And this is something that folks at the Partnership on AI have written about for assessing disparities in performance for different demographic groups. You need some sort of labels or data around those demographic groups. And so this is often in tension with privacy requirements. And so I think this is an open challenge, open question.
Thank you for that. Unless there's anything else to add, I suggest we take one more question.
No, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. I see one hand back there, all the way back there.
Thanks. I'm gonna link again to the comment made early on, and also talking about stakeholders' participation and stakeholders' involvement. We often refer to like participation as a very dry way, and we always look at stakeholders' involvement from a top-down fashion. I'm just wondering if, closing on a positive note, if you can quote some examples and case studies where stakeholders were involved and actually uplifted in their involvement and considered as true experts in the AI system.
I think that's a great note to end on. I'll open it up to all three speakers.
I see Michael nodding very
Starting with
enthusiastically.
Michael, and then we'll make our way back here to Brussels.
Yeah, I love this question. I love this point, and I want to highlight some amazing work from researchers like Christina Harrington, who has done a lot of work on community-based participatory research with Black and African American communities in the U.S., Tawana Dillahunt, who's done a lot of work on like workforce development technologies and really involving and actually partnering with community organizations. Mary Gray's work working with community health organizations in algorithmic systems, and then just some of Sasha Costanza-Chock's work on design justice and arguing that we really need to be designing with communities. So in her work, looking at sort of disability justice and and other types of communities. But yeah, allowing community organizations to lead and not trying to be extractive or co-opt that work, I think is really an important way to do it. So I really point to those people's work, those women's work, and really suggest that people can look to their examples here.
Thank you for highlighting those. That's very important. Please go ahead, Colin.
Maybe it's not the community, but I also sometimes see, at least from citizens or companies, sometimes also a bit of adversarial reaction to some of the government's use of AI as a counteract. So an example from the Netherlands, I'm not sure if it's allowed anymore, but many municipalities, they drive around with these camera cars to check if you're parked correctly. So they use license plate recognition, so you can immediately scan if your car is properly parked and or paid for the ticket. So eventually that caused some reactions from, I think, some gruntled developers. So what they did, they made a camera that was capable of detecting the cars that were, driving around, and then would give you a text message saying that, the car was just drove around and you have like 15 minutes or something to still pay for your ticket so you don't get a fine. So you also see some of these projects coming up as a way of a counter narrative, or I think in the US there's also this app that helps you with fines. If the government gives you a fine, you can automatically do an objection. So you see a lot of government organizations automating, received objections, but now you see also some initiatives to forward them automatically. So it's quite an interesting battle going on there.
That's great. Stefan?
Yeah, and I think generally you see in the Netherlands, but internationally, this really big movement of getting people involved in talking about AI, regardless of specific applications. So in the Netherlands, we're working with UNESCO on getting this dialogue started. There are national programs in all of the public libraries to get people talking and debating about AI. There are these citizen panels on AI that are being set up. So I think there is a lot of momentum to get people involved and to hear their voices and to think with them on how do we want to use this technology. So yeah, that's a good positive note to end on.
Definitely.
Similarly with the IEEE standards, yes, they're wonderful. It's good that we have these things.
On that positive note, thank you very much to our excellent speakers and the audience for your engagement. It's been great.